March 15, 1945, west bank of the Rhine, Germany. Dawn came gray and heavy over the river. Mist clung to the girders of the half-ruined span like smoke that refused to lift. Below it, the water carried flecks of ice, grinding softly against the stone abutments. From the east bank came the staccato crack of small arms, measured and deliberate, harassing fire to remind the Americans that the Germans still held the far shore. Lieutenant John Jack Myers crouched in the silt behind the western pier, the map folded in his hand already damp with fog. The bridge had been marked for destruction in every German order captured during the last week's advance. Its loss would choke the supply artery of the 79th Infantry Division, halting the push toward Dusseldorf. If it held, the engineers could have pontoons in place within a day. If it fell, they would lose a week. Through his field glasses, Myers saw the glint of twisted wire hanging under the main truss. The Germans had done their work well. A crisscross of primacord hung like cobwebs along the lower beams. At least 6 demolition charges were visible, each wired into junction boxes sunk into the girders. Some looked fresh, new insulation, tight binding. Others, scorched by previous shellfire, sagged into the wind. "Looks like they had time to do it right," Sergeant Tom Reed muttered beside him. Reed was an Iowa farm boy turned combat engineer, his hands perpetually scarred from both work and war. He traced the lines of the bridge with his eyes, calculating angles, spans, the weight of metal above their heads. "Do it right," Myers said quietly, "but not fast enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Behind them, the rest of Company C was moving up the embankment in staggered file, 30 engineers carrying satchels of tools, wire cutters, and insulated gloves. 2 carried rifles, the rest had carbines slung awkwardly behind demolition gear. Somewhere upriver, the rumble of an M4 Sherman marked the infantry's flank support. The bridge had been built in 1912, part of the old Reichsbahn network. 2 steel spans, each 110 feet, joined at a central pier of stone. German engineers had converted it into a demolition trap, a standard procedure under Sprengbevel 44/1, the standing order that no retreating unit would leave a usable crossing. The charges were likely double-wired, 1 electric, 1 manual. Captured field manuals showed how the Germans ran redundant circuits to guarantee destruction even under interference. Myers knelt and traced a line in the mud with his glove. "We'll have to cut in 3 teams. 1 up top, 2 underneath. We start with the primer cords near the west span. If they've got junction boxes on both sides, we'll isolate before we clip." Reed nodded. "And the fire from the far bank?" "Infantry'll keep them honest." A bullet snapped past, biting into the girder above. Both men flattened instinctively. On the far side, a German MG-42 chattered, short bursts, disciplined, a professional's warning. Tracers streaked low across the water, bouncing sparks off the steel. "Guess they know we're here," Reed said. Myers exhaled slowly. "They know. They just don't know what we're about to do." At 0600 hours the first section of engineers crawled onto the bridge deck. They moved prone, using the thick fog as their only cover. The mist muffled sound, turning every metal creak into a whisper. Corporal Jacobs, radio man, checked in with Battalion Net, Eagle 3 to baseplate, commencing inspection. "Light resistance across river." "Over." The Germans had left a few planks missing from the deck, forcing the Americans to move in single file. Beneath the flooring, wires twisted into the girders like veins in stone. Reed reached down and touched one, cold, taut. He followed it to a charge fixed under a steel joint, wrapped in waxed paper stamped Sprengstoff 28. "Definite electric cap," he murmured. "Leads heading east." Myers's jaw tightened. That meant the detonator relay was still live. Somewhere across the river, a German hand could still close the circuit. He raised his binoculars again. The far bank was a thin ribbon of rubble, burned farmhouses, the skeletal outlines of trees stripped by artillery. He couldn't see the enemy, but he felt them, quiet, waiting, perhaps watching the same bridge through their own lenses. He turned to Reed. "If they touch that switch, this whole river goes up." Reed grinned, a thin line of teeth through grime. "Then we'd better cut faster than they can think." Behind them, the engineers spread out along the truss, their movements deliberate, rhythmic, professional. Machine guns barked from across the river, and the bridge answered only with the whisper of boots on steel and the faint metallic click of wire cutters opening. The battle for the bridge had begun, not with an explosion, but with the defusing of one. March 15, 1945, 0635 hours, Rhine River. The fog thickened, rolling like smoke through the trusses, carrying the bitter scent of cordite and wet rust. Beneath the bridge, the river boiled in slow gray eddies. To Lieutenant Myers, it felt like being suspended between two worlds, order and chaos, life and demolition, connected only by the thin copper wires that could erase both in an instant. Sergeant Reed was the first to find the main detonator box. It was wedged under a crossbeam near the western abutment, protected by a makeshift steel plate welded into place. The Germans had built it to last, sealed it with tar to resist water and time. On its face were two binding posts, both alive with current. Reed tapped the casing lightly. "Still hot," he said. Myers crouched beside him, checking the voltmeter clipped to his belt. The needle flickered. "Full charge from the east bank. They've got a generator running over there. If they throw the switch, we don't get a warning." A burst of MG-42 fire cut across the bridge, sending sparks from the steel deck. Two engineers flattened themselves against the railing. The gunner was clever, 3-second bursts, no tracers, trying to bait movement. "Get your head down." Reed barked. "Already am," someone muttered. Myers studied the wires leading from the junction box. They were twisted in pairs, one black, one red, disappearing into the fog toward the center of the bridge. Some were beneath the span, another set of boxes waited, secondary circuits, probably linked in parallel. That meant even if they cut one, the others could still detonate. He looked at Reed. "We isolate the west span first. Clip the lead here, insulate, then move center." Reed nodded. "I'll do it. You coordinate the teams." He took out his rubber gloves, army issue, thick and awkward, and pulled them over his raw hands. The gloves were stiff from cold. He reached for his cutters, the jaws gleaming faintly in the mist. Myers keyed his radio. "Eagle 3 to baseplate, active current confirmed. Proceeding with manual isolation." "Over." The response came back through static. "Copy, Eagle 3. Infantry reports enemy observers on the far embankment. Keep your men low." "Roger that," Myers said, and looked up as Reed's cutters closed on the wire. There was a click, then a faint hiss. The voltage meter dropped to 0. Reed grinned under his helmet. West span isolated. The relief lasted seconds. From the far shore came a sudden flash, yellow, sharp, too clean to be artillery. A split second later, the center span shuddered. Dust rained from the overhead beams. "Secondary charge," someone yelled. "No," Myers shouted. "Test current, they're trying to scare us." He was right. The flash had been an arc discharge, not an explosion, Germans checking their circuit, proving it still worked. Psychological warfare in a wire. The engineers moved faster now. Corporal Jacobs and his team crawled along the underside of the bridge, the sound of their tools echoing through the steel like the ticking of a clock. Each section revealed more wiring, more carefully hidden primer cords, each leading toward the east bank where the final detonator relay lay unseen. At 0700, the first casualties came. Private Lewis, carrying a coil of insulated tape, took a bullet through the calf. He fell without a sound, blood pooling on the cold steel. Two men dragged him back toward the pier while the others kept working. Reed didn't stop. "They're aiming at sparks," he muttered. "They see light, they shoot. Keep your hands low." By now, the bridge was a living thing, metal trembling under every burst of gunfire, cables groaning under the weight of men in tension. Across the water, artillery thundered. The infantry on the west bank began laying down suppressive fire, heavy and methodical. Myers glanced up through the lattice of beams. If they're testing current, they're watching. They'll wait until we're halfway through before they detonate. Reed's reply came without looking up. Then let's not give them halfway. He reached the second junction box, deeper under the span. It was smaller, crudely bolted to the beam. Reed cut the first wire cleanly, insulated it, then the second. Again, the voltmeter needle fell. 2 spans down. 1 to go. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear, a low electric hum, faint but unmistakable. Reed's eyes widened. They've engaged the circuit. Myers reacted instantly. All teams, cut every visible line. Now. The bridge erupted in motion, men crawling, shouting, wires snapping under desperate cuts. For a moment the fog itself seemed to glow with unseen current. Then silence. Reed checked the voltmeter again. Dead. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. They tried to blow it, he said softly. We beat the current by seconds. Myers stared at the still wires, limp and harmless in his hand. Seconds, he repeated. That's all a bridge ever has between life and death. And below them, the Rhine kept moving, cold, steady, indifferent to the men and the wires that defied it. March 15, 1945, 0745 hours, west bank of the Rhine. The sun finally began to press through the fog, turning the water below to molten silver. Smoke drifted from the far bank, curling through the air like slow handwriting. To Lieutenant Myers, it was the most dangerous hour of all. The light made them visible. The Germans would see everything now, the severed wires, the crouched engineers, the bridge that refused to die. Infantry of the 27th Armored Regiment had begun to push toward the east shore, rifles up, using the bridge girders as partial cover. Sergeant Reed and his men, their uniforms blackened with grease and cordite, kept working under the truss where the final detonator lay hidden. They'd found it wedged inside a drainage recess, a steel box with a hand-crank generator beside it. The setup was old, improvised, and dangerous, likely a backup for manual detonation if the electric line failed. A single pull could still ignite the primer cord embedded in the piers. German fallback system, Reed muttered. They were planning for us to cut the wires. Myers examined it carefully. We can't just yank it out. There's pressure wiring, booby traps maybe. We'll need to neutralize it in place. The wind carried the dull chatter of MG-42s again. From the opposite embankment, muzzle flashes flared through the morning haze. The enemy had moved their position slightly south, finding an angle that gave them a clean shot down the bridge's length. Bullets sparked across the steel like angry insects. Private First Class Leary returned fire with his M1, 3 measured shots before ducking back. They're using tracer now. Trying to bracket us. Let them, Reed said. Every round they waste on us is one less for the infantry. He gestured for his tools, then slid down beside the detonator box. Each movement was deliberate, slow, as if the air itself might explode at the wrong vibration. He cleared mud from the side panel, revealing German stenciling, Sprengstoffleitung 3A, Demolition Circuit 3A. Inside were 6 primer cords, bundled together with wax twine, running into the masonry pier. A single charge here could collapse half the bridge into the river. Myers crouched beside him. You see the bypass? Reed nodded. Yeah. They wired redundancy. Even if this box goes, current could still run through the auxiliary link under the span. We'll need to trace that next. He began cutting, 1 wire at a time. With each snip, a brief spark jumped, the tiny light reflected in his eyes. When the last cord was severed, he leaned back, exhaled slowly, and whispered, safe. For now. At 0815 hours, the 1st Armor from the 9th Armored Division reached the western approach. A Sherman stopped at the base of the span, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. The commander leaned out of the hatch, scanning the engineers through his binoculars. You boys finished saving the bridge? He called. Almost, Myers shouted back. Give us 10 more minutes, and you can drive to Berlin. The commander grinned. Copy that. We'll warm up the engines. But the laughter was brief. An incoming mortar shell whistled in, exploding against the western embankment. Earth and steel rained down. The concussion made the bridge tremble. Myers threw himself flat, the air sucked from his lungs. Reed, he shouted. I'm here, came the reply, half coughed through dust. Box intact. Good. Then we keep going. By 08:30, they had neutralized the final connection under the east truss. The bridge, for the first time that morning, was electrically dead. The copper wires hung like vines, cut and useless. Reed sat back against a girder, sweat streaking the grime on his face. You realize, he said, if they'd used a chemical fuse backup, we'd be swimming right now. Myers smiled faintly. If they'd used half their brains, this bridge would have been rubble 2 hours ago. He keyed his radio. Eagle 3 to baseplate, demolition system neutralized. Bridge secure for crossing. Static crackled, then the reply, copy, Eagle 3. Armor moving across. You've just opened the Rhine. The words settled over the men like sunlight breaking through smoke. Myers stood, looking east where the fog had lifted to reveal the distant shore. He could see figures retreating, German sappers, abandoning their failed trap. The sound of tanks grinding forward filled the air, heavy, unstoppable. He turned to Reed. You ever think about what this means? Reed wiped his hands on his trousers. Means we just built the road to Germany's front porch. Above them, the bridge creaked, alive again, not as a weapon, but as a passage. Trucks rumbled forward, the first of hundreds that would follow. Behind them, medics carried the wounded, and above it all, the engineers stood watching, silent, the last guardians of a span that by all logic should have been ash on the river. The Rhine glistened below, carrying away fragments of wire and wood, remnants of the night's failed destruction. And for the first time in days, Lieutenant Myers allowed himself to believe they might live long enough to see the other side. March 15, 1945, 0900 hours, Ludendorff Bridge sector, Rhine River. The bridge had survived the night, but daylight brought a new kind of danger. With the smoke thinning and the fog gone, the structure was now the most visible target on the Western Front. Its steel skeleton gleamed like a signal mirror to the sky, an invitation for every German battery east of the Rhine to take aim. The engineers had barely finished their inspection when the first artillery rounds began to fall. They came in groups of 3, shrieking from across the river, striking the far end of the span with teeth-rattling force. Steel plates buckled. Rivets flew like shrapnel. One round landed short, sending a column of muddy water 50 feet into the air. Lieutenant Myers ducked behind the railing as the concussion washed over him. They're zeroing us in, he shouted. They've got our range. Sergeant Reed, crouched beside him, checked the map case clutched to his chest. If they're bringing in heavy artillery, it means they know the bridge is still standing. They'll keep firing until it's gone, or until we are. Then we make sure neither happens, Myers said grimly. Below the deck, the remaining engineers scrambled to secure the structural points weakened by explosion shock. The first tank, Boilermaker, a Sherman of the 9th Armored, had already rolled halfway across, its treads clanging like a clockwork heartbeat. The entire span flexed with every step of its weight. Corporal Jacobs shouted over the din, "Sir, these piers weren't built for this kind of stress." "Neither were we," Myers replied. "Keep moving." At 0910 hours, Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes appeared, twin-engine FW-190s, circling low, engines growling like hornets. They weren't bombing yet, just observing. The men could almost feel the gaze of the pilots, tracing the outlines of the bridge, measuring for destruction. Moments later, a pair of P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead, diving out of the east. The air vibrated as they streaked past, gunfire flashing from their wings. The Focke-Wulfs peeled away, chased into the clouds. Cheers erupted from the men below. "Guess somebody up there likes us," Reed said, half grinning. Yeah, Myers muttered, but he's got a busy morning. Down on the water, an engineer boat crew maneuvered toward the pier. They carried the last demolition debris to dump into the current, coils of diffused wire, empty detonator casings, and fragments of German explosive charges. Each piece that sank beneath the Rhine marked another failure of Hitler's last defense line. Reed joined them briefly, hauling a box over the side. "Send it to the bottom," he said. "Let the river keep it." By mid-morning, traffic had become a steady flow. Jeeps, half-tracks, and Shermans rolled across the span in single file, each driver white-knuckled, eyes fixed on the far bank. The engineers stood off to the sides, silent witnesses to the impossible, the crossing of an army over a bridge that, hours ago, had been wired for annihilation. Then came the counterattack. At 0940, incoming shells slammed into the western approach. Dirt geysered upward, men scattering. The Germans had brought in self-propelled guns from the 11th Panzer Division, 88mm pieces firing from concealed positions near Linz. The rounds were precise, methodical. "Target the approaches," Myers shouted to the infantry. "Keep their heads down." Machine guns barked from sandbag nests. The sound became a single, continuous roar that rolled down the river valley. Reed reloaded his carbine, fired twice into the treeline, then turned back to the bridge where a hit had twisted one of the outer girders. "Structural damage," Jacobs yelled. "South beam sheared halfway." "Patch it with crossbar steel," Reed ordered. "We only need it to hold another 12 hours. Above them, the thunderbolts returned, diving low to strike at the German gun batteries. Explosions rippled through the far hills. Smoke rose, black and oily. The enemy fire slackened. By 1,000 hours, the sky was littered with drifting ash. The bridge still stood. Myers climbed onto the deck, surveying the wreckage, the holes punched through the truss, the scorch marks, the trembling cables. Every instinct told him it shouldn't be there. Yet it was. He looked over at Reed. "You ever think about the men who built this? German hands, 1916. They designed it for war, and now we're using it to end one." Reed nodded slowly. "Yeah. Funny how steel doesn't care who wins. It just waits for whoever's left to cross." As another tank rumbled onto the deck, its treads shaking the rivets, Myers glanced east toward the smoke-stained horizon. The Rhine lay beneath them, silent, eternal, carrying the wreckage of empire away with every passing minute. For the engineers of the 291st, it wasn't victory yet. But as the first full battalion made it across the span, they knew they had built the road to it, one wire, one cut, one heartbeat at a time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. March 15, 1945, 1030 hours, east bank of the Rhine, near Remagen. The first tanks thundered off the bridge onto German soil just as the sky began to change, an unnatural darkness, thick with smoke and cordite. The Luftwaffe was coming. From the east, a low hum swelled into a roar, engines converging in formation. Shadows crossed the river, slicing over the bridge like the hands of a clock. Lieutenant Myers felt the vibration first through his boots, the deep pulse of approaching bombers. "Incoming," someone shouted, but the warning was swallowed by the scream of sirens and the metallic thunder of anti-aircraft guns opening fire from both banks. For Dornier du 217 swept in low, their wings flashing silver. Bomb racks clattered, and seconds later the sky erupted. The first bomb struck short, exploding in the river and throwing a curtain of water across the bridge. The second hit closer, shattering a section of railing and punching a crater into the deck plating. The engineers scattered for cover, the air thick with shrapnel and dust. Sergeant Reed threw himself behind a girder, shielding his face from flying debris. "They're targeting the piers," he yelled. "They want it in the water." Myers shouted back. "They'll take their own men with it if they have to." The bridge swayed violently as another explosion rocked the eastern approach. Steel cables shrieked in protest. A jeep, mid-crossing, flipped onto its side, spilling 2 medics into the open. Myers sprinted forward, dragging one man to cover, his helmet ringing from concussive blasts. Above, the P-47 Thunderbolts returned, American fighters diving straight into the path of the bombers. One Thunderbolt raked the lead Dornier with gunfire, ripping into its fuselage until it burst into flame. The bomber spiraled down, crashing into the far hillside. The men on the bridge cheered instinctively, even as more bombs fell around them. Reed wiped soot from his face. "That pilot just bought us another hour." "Then we use it," Myers said. "Get damage control working. I want deck repairs now." Within minutes, engineers were back on the girders, hauling timber and steel plates from nearby trucks. They patched holes with whatever they could find, scrap wood, spare rails, even sections of tank tread. The river below ran black with oil and smoke. At 1,100 hours, a German shell found the western pier. The impact tore a gash into the concrete, sending chunks of masonry into the current. The bridge groaned but held. Reed stared at the cracked column and muttered, "She's bleeding, but she's still breathing." Myers keyed his radio. "Eagle 3 to baseplate, bridge sustaining structural hits, but remains operational. Reinforcements crossing now." "Copy, Eagle 3, came the reply. Command says hold until relieved." "Hold," Myers repeated quietly, looking across the span. "That's all we've been doing since yesterday." By noon, the Luftwaffe's attack had broken apart. The last bomber dropped its load wide and limped eastward, pursued by Thunderbolts. What remained was silence, a strained, heavy quiet filled only by the clank of tools and the occasional burst of rifle fire from across the river. Then came the infantry, hundreds of them, trudging over the patched deck, their boots ringing against the steel. Each man carried the same expression, disbelief that the bridge was still there. One sergeant from the 9th Armored stopped to salute Myers. "Heard you boys kept this thing from blowing sky high," he said. Myers nodded wearily. "We just pulled the teeth out of it." The soldier grinned. "Well, sir, the whole damn army's crossing through your dental work." Laughter rippled down the line, tired, raw, but real. For the first time since dawn, the men allowed themselves to breathe. By 1300 hours, the bridge was choked with traffic. Tanks, trucks, and endless columns of men poured across into Germany. The engineers stood aside, watching it all in stunned silence. Reed leaned on the railing, eyes following the flow. "We defused their bridge, and now we're using it to end their war. There's poetry in that." Myers said nothing. He just looked down at the cracked steel, the burned timbers, the stains of oil and blood, and thought of all the bridges that had never made it this far. When the last tank rolled past, the structure trembled again, a deep, tired groan that sounded almost human. Reed glanced up. "She's holding, but not for long." Myers exhaled. "She only has to hold long enough." As the sun broke through the smoke, the bridge glowed in dull gold, a wounded monument to endurance. And below, the Rhine carried away the ashes of every failed defense, every broken wire, every fear that had once promised to destroy it. Against all odds, the bridge still stood. And so did the men who saved it. March 15, 1945, 1,500 hours, Remagen bridgehead. By mid-afternoon, the noise had faded into a strange kind of quiet, the kind only war could make, filled not with peace but exhaustion. The Luftwaffe was gone, their last bombing runs driven off by the P-47s. The artillery had fallen silent. Even the river seemed subdued, its wide surface reflecting smoke and sunlight like a tarnished mirror. Lieutenant Myers stood on the eastern approach, helmet pushed back, watching as the endless stream of men and machines crossed behind him. Every tread mark, every boot print, carved history into the steel. The bridge had become something more than an objective now, it was a symbol, a promise that Germany's final line had been breached. Still, the bridge groaned. Every passing tank sent tremors through its bones. The engineers could feel it underfoot, like a wounded giant's heartbeat. Sergeant Reed had taken to marking stress points with chalk, white XS wherever a crack spread or a rivet popped. By the time he reached the mid-span, there were dozens. "She's not going to last much longer," he muttered. Myers joined him, squinting at a hairline fracture running along the lower truss. "No," he said quietly, "but she doesn't have to. By tomorrow, we'll have pontoon bridges across the river. Her work's almost done." Reed gave a dry laugh. "I'll believe it when I see it." A gust of wind swept through the lattice, carrying the smell of oil and cordite. Across the river, American bulldozers growled to life, chewing into the mud to anchor the first pontoon sections. The engineers on the far bank waved, small figures in a vast gray world. At 1,530 hours, a messenger jeep screeched to a halt beside them. A lieutenant from Division HQ stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Orders from Colonel Norton," he said. "You're to hold this bridge until the pontoon is operational. After that, demolition's authorized." Reed blinked. "Demolition? You mean we save it just to blow it up?" The officer nodded. "Once the army's across, it becomes a liability. They'll be targeting it until it's gone. Better we do it on our own terms." He left without another word. The sound of his jeep faded into the traffic. Myers stared out over the river, jaw tightening. "We've been killing ourselves to keep it standing," he said. "And now we'll have to destroy it ourselves." "That's war, sir," Reed said quietly. "We build what we must, and we break what we can't keep." For a moment neither spoke. The bridge creaked again, as if hearing its sentence. At 1,600 hours, another tremor rippled through the deck, not from tanks this time, but from deep within the structure. The engineers froze. "Pier movement!" Jacobs yelled from below. "South column shifting." Myers ran to the edge, peering down. The southern pier had cracked further, water surged through gaps in the masonry. The constant strain and concussion from artillery had finally found a weakness. "Reed, get the support cables in place. We're not losing it now." Men scrambled into position, driving steel anchors and reinforcing with chains scavenged from supply trucks. They worked like shipwrights in a storm, every clang of hammer and chain echoing across the valley. When the cables went taut, the bridge steadied again. For the moment, it held. By sunset, the last American columns had crossed. The west bank was nearly empty now, just a few tanks standing guard, their turrets scanning the ridgelines. The engineers sat down on the deck, too tired to speak, eating cold rations in the fading light. Reed looked toward the far shore. "They'll write about this one day," he said. "They'll say a bridge stood when it shouldn't have. They'll forget the men who held the wires." Myers smiled faintly. "That's all right. The river remembers." The wind picked up again, rattling the loose plates. Below, the Rhine moved steadily, implacable, carrying with it the wreckage of two empires, the one that built the bridge, and the one that had tried to blow it apart. As night fell, the engineers began their watch. The sky turned black and starlit, the bridge a shadow stretching between two worlds. For now, it still stood, defiant, scarred, and alive. And the men who saved it waited in silence, knowing that before long, they would have to be the ones to end it. March 17, 1945, 0430 hours, Ludendorff Bridge, Remagen. By the 17th, the bridge had outlived every prediction. 2 days past its supposed collapse, it still bore the weight of convoys crossing east. The engineers no longer joked about its strength, they whispered about it. Even the infantrymen who once cursed its vibrations began to cross themselves before stepping onto the steel. Captain Myers hadn't slept in 36 hours. He walked the span one last time before dawn, lantern swinging in his hand, the light tracing the jagged outlines of cracked girders and twisted bolts. Every surface bore the marks of war, shrapnel pockmarks, scorched paint, bullet scars. Yet somehow it stood, held together by rust, luck, and men who refused to abandon it. At the midspan, Sergeant Reed crouched beside the main girder, studying the stress gauge they'd installed the day before. The needle trembled close to the red. "She's breathing hard, sir," he said. If we push another convoy before daylight, she might let go. Myers stared at the gauge, then toward the far bank, where headlights glimmered like a stream of fireflies. Orders are to keep it open until the last tank's across, he said. Then we blow it. Reed exhaled through his teeth. You think they'll actually do it? They'll have to. The Germans know it's our lifeline. Every battery west of the Rhine's been hammering it. If they can't destroy it, we will, before they bury us with it. At 0500, the first tremor of artillery rolled over the valley. The Luftwaffe had been nearly destroyed, but not entirely gone. That morning, a formation of Arado jet bombers streaked over the river at low altitude. Their bombs missed the bridge by yards, erupting in geysers of water that drenched the deck and sent men sprawling. Jesus, they're using jets now? Reed shouted, hauling himself up. Myers nodded grimly. Desperation makes invention. Fragments rained down like hail. One of the pontoon bridges downstream took a direct hit, splintering apart in a burst of fire. For the next hour, the engineers braced for more, but the sky remained empty. The jets didn't return. By sunrise, the bridge was steaming from the cold. Frost glistened along the handrails, the air filled with the metallic scent of damp iron. Myers stood at the western abutment, watching ambulances roll past, wounded men from the far shore, some barely conscious. The bridge that carried tanks forward now carried the broken back. A dispatch rider arrived around 0700, mud streaking his face. Message from Division HQ, he shouted, handing over the envelope. Myers broke the seal and scanned the paper. To 51st Engineer Combat Battalion. Subject, Structural Assessment, Ludendorff Bridge. Directive, Prepare immediate demolition contingency. Below the typed lines was a handwritten note from Colonel Norton. She's done her job. When the replacement crossings are stable, bring her down. Make it clean. The brass wants film footage. Myers folded the paper slowly. Film footage, he repeated. They want a movie of her dying. Reed gave a bitter chuckle. They'll get one hell of a picture. The rest of the morning passed in anxious silence. The demolition team set new charges, not to save, but to end. They worked with the same precision as before, threading wires through cracked steel, measuring detonation times, verifying each circuit twice. The bridge was their patient, and they were its surgeons preparing a final mercy. At noon, they heard the news: American forces had secured the east bank beyond the hills. The bridge had done what no one believed possible. It had given the Allies a direct crossing into the heart of Germany. Myers gathered his men on the deck. We've done our part, he said quietly. Now we step back. They stood together, looking down the length of the span. Beneath them, the Rhine shimmered, a gray artery flowing toward the sea. For a moment, none spoke. Then Reed saluted the bridge itself, a small gesture lost in the wind. At 1,500 hours, the first stress beam gave way. A sharp metallic groan rose from the south pier. Engineers ran, shouting warnings, but there was no stopping it. With a thunderous crack, the central span sagged, then folded inward, sending a wave of water and debris into the air. The Ludendorff Bridge had finally surrendered, not to bombs or bullets, but to exhaustion. When the spray cleared, only the skeletal remains of the trusses jutted from the river. The engineers stood on the bank in silence. Some cheered weakly, others simply watched. Reed took off his helmet, staring at the wreckage. She died on her own terms, he said softly. Myers nodded. So did we. For the first time in weeks, he felt the ache of stillness. The noise, the danger, the duty, all of it seemed to drift away with the smoke rising from the river. The bridge that shouldn't have lived had carried them farther than anyone believed possible. Now, it rested. April 1945, the Rhine, Remagen to Cologne. The bridge was gone, but its shadow remained. Long after the last girder vanished beneath the current, men still spoke of it, quietly, reverently, as if the structure had taken on a soul of its own. For those who had fought to hold it, the Ludendorff Bridge became a kind of ghost, an iron apparition that haunted their dreams and filled their reports. Captain Myers wrote in his final engineering log on April 2, 1945, "The bridge did not fail. It completed its duty and collapsed only when replaced by others. No structure could have done more." His words were dry, professional, the tone of a man who had seen too much to romanticize, but even the official record carried an undertone of grief. Across the Rhine, the war was moving swiftly now. Patton's Third Army had crossed at Oppenheim, Simpson's Ninth near Wesel. The breach at Remagen had opened the way for armies to flood into the heart of Germany. By the time the engineers packed their remaining equipment, the Rhine, the fabled impenetrable line, had become a river of history, not defense. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion bivouacked near Erpel, where the remnants of the bridge jutted from the water like broken ribs. They lived among ruins, burned trucks, twisted rebar, abandoned helmets half buried in silt. Each day, German civilians from nearby villages came to stare across the water, silent and pale. Some crossed themselves. Others simply wept. Sergeant Reed sat on a fragment of decking one morning, writing a letter home. His pencil traced slow, deliberate lines. "We built it, saved it, lost it. Funny thing is, I think it saved us, too. If not for the bridge, we'd still be on the West Bank, waiting for orders that never came." He folded the paper, slipped it into his jacket, and went back to work, pretending not to notice how many names were missing from the roster. The Army photographers arrived on April 10. They set up tripods along the west shore, recording the wreckage for posterity. "Historical record," one of them said as he adjusted his lens. "They'll show this in newsreels back home." Myers said nothing. He simply watched the shutter flick open and closed, capturing the stillness where once there had been thunder. In the evenings, when the wind came up the river valley, the engineers swore they could still hear the echo of the bridge, metal shifting in the current, ghostly creaks that sounded like voices. It wasn't superstition, exactly. It was memory given sound. By mid-April, the unit was reassigned to bridge building duty along the Elbe. The men packed their gear into trucks and drove east, past villages reduced to stone, through fields still smoking from battle. The war was nearly over, Berlin only weeks away, but none of them felt victorious. The cost had been measured in more than lives. It was measured in years of fear, in nights without sleep, in bridges that collapsed long after being saved. Myers left Remagen last. He stood by the riverbank at dusk, where the water caught the orange light of sunset. He thought of the men who'd died wiring and unwiring the charges, the ones who'd crawled under fire to keep the girders alive. He thought, too, of the German engineers who'd built the bridge in 1916, men who could never have imagined that American hands would one day fight to preserve their work. History, he realized, had no loyalty. It served whoever crossed first. When the trucks started their engines, Myers turned away from the water. "All right," he said. "Let's go build something else." The convoy rumbled east. Behind them, the river swallowed the last of the bridge's iron bones. Within weeks, grass would grow over the banks. Within months, only photographs and official reports would remain. Years later, at the 1962 U.S. German Engineers Symposium in Bonn, former enemies shook hands and spoke of shared craftsmanship. A German colonel, gray-haired, dignified, stood and said, "The Ludendorff Bridge was built to last 50 years. It lasted through 3 wars and ended one." The room fell silent. Myers, now retired, smiled faintly. He knew the truth. It hadn't been steel or rivets that made the bridge endure. It had been the men, American and German alike, who had refused to let it die before its time. And though the Rhine flowed on, indifferent as ever, the story of that bridge, wired for destruction, saved under fire, and sacrificed in triumph, remained, suspended forever between banks of history and memory. The bridge had fallen, but the crossing never ended.